Virago Ghost Stories, read by Patricia Hodge. The July Ghost, by A.S. Byatt. "I think I must move out of where I'm living," he said. "I have this problem with my landlady." He picked a long, bright hair off the back of her dress, so deftly that the act seemed considerate. He had been skillful at balancing glass, plate, and cutlery, too. He had a look of dignified misery, like a dejected hawk. She was interested. "What sort of problem? Amatory, financial, or domestic?" "None of those, really. Well, not financial." He turned the hair on his finger, examining it intently, not meeting her eye. "Not financial? Can you tell me? I might know somewhere you could stay. I know a lot of people." "You would," he smiled shyly. "It's not an easy problem to describe. There's just the two of us. I occupy the attics, mostly." He came to a stop. He was obviously reserved and secretive, but he was telling her something. This is usually attractive. "Mostly?" encouraging him. "Oh, it's not like that. Well, not... Shall we sit down?" They moved across the party, which was a big party, on a hot day. He stopped and found a bottle and filled her glass. He had not needed to ask what she was drinking. They sat side by side on a sofa. He admired the brilliant poppies bowled on her emerald dress and her pretty sandals. She had come to London for the summer to work in the British Museum. She could really have managed with microfilm in Tucson for what little manuscript research was needed, but there was a dragging love affair to end. There is an age at which, however desperately happy one is in stolen moments, days or weekends with one's married professor, one either prizes him loose or cuts and runs. She had had a stab at both, and now considered she had successfully cut and run. So it was nice to be immediately appreciated. Problems are capable of solution. She said as much to him, turning her soft face to his ravaged one, swinging the long, bright hair. It had begun a year ago, he told her in a rush. At another party, actually. He'd met this woman, the landlady in question, and had made, not immediately, a kind of faux pas, he now saw, and she'd been very decent, all things considered, and so... He had said, "I think I must move out of where I'm living." He had been quite wild, had nearly not come to the party, but could not go on drinking alone. The woman had considered him coolly and asked, "Why?" One could not, he said, go on in a place where one had once been blissfully happy and was now miserable, however convenient the place. Convenient that was for work and friends and things that seemed, as he mentioned them, ashy and insubstantial compared to the memory and the hope of opening the door and finding Anne outside it, laughing and breathless, waiting to be told what he had read or thought or eaten or felt that day. "Someone I loved left," he told the woman. Reticent on that occasion, too, he bit back the flurry of sentences about the total unexpectedness of it, the arriving back and finding only an envelope on a clean table, and spaces in the bookshelves, the record stack, the kitchen cupboard. It must have been planned for weeks. She must have been thinking it out while he rolled on her, while she poured wine for him, while... No. Vituperation is undignified, and in this case what he felt was lower and worse than rage. Just pure, childlike loss. "One ought not to mind places," he said to the woman. "But one does," she had said. "I know." She had suggested to him that he could come and be her lodger then. She had, she said, a lot of spare space going to waste, and her husband wasn't there much. "We've not had a lot to say to each other lately." He could be quite self-contained. There was a kitchen and bathroom in the attics. She wouldn't bother him. There was a large garden. It was possible that this decided him. It was very hot, central London, the time of year when a man feels he would give anything to live in a room opening onto grass and trees, not a high flat in a dusty street. And if Anne came back, the door would be locked and mortice locked. He could stop thinking about Anne coming back. That was a decisive move. Anne thought he wasn't decisive. He would live without Anne. For some weeks after he moved in, he'd seen very little of the woman. They met on the stairs, and once she came up, on a hot Sunday, to tell him he must feel free to use the garden. He had offered to do some weeding and mowing, and she had accepted. That was the weekend her husband came back, driving furiously up to the front door, running in and calling in the empty hall, "Imogen! Imogen!" To which she had replied, uncharacteristically, by screaming hysterically. There was nothing in her husband Noel's appearance to warrant this reaction. Their lodger, peering over the banister at the sound, had seen their upturned faces in the stairwell and watched hers settle into its usual prim and placid expression as he did so. Seeing Noel, a balding, fluffy-templed, stooping 35 or so, shabby corduroy suit, cotton polo, he realized he was now able to guess her age, as he had not been. She was a very neat woman, faded blonde, her hair in a knot at the back of her head, her legs long and slender, her eyes downcast. Mild was not quite the right word for her, though. She explained then that she had screamed because Noel had come home unexpectedly and startled her. She was sorry. It seemed a reasonable explanation. The extraordinary vehemence of the screaming was probably an echo in the stairwell. Noel seemed wholly downcast by it, all the same. He had kept out of the way that weekend, taking the stairs 2 at a time and lightly, feeling a little aggrieved, looking out of his kitchen window into the lovely overgrown garden, that they were lurking indoors, wasting all the summer sun. At Sunday lunchtime, he had heard the husband, Noel, shouting on the stairs, "I can't go on if you go on like that. I've done my best. I've tried to get through. Nothing will shift you, will it? You won't try, will you? You'll just go on and on. Well, I have a life to live. You can't throw a life away, can you?" He had crept out again on the dark upper landing and seen her standing halfway down the stairs, quite still, watching Noel wave his arms and roar, with a look of impassive patience, as though this nuisance must pass off. Noel swallowed and gasped. He turned his face up to her and said plaintively, "You do see I can't stand it. I'll be in touch, shall I? You must want... You must need... You must..." She didn't speak. "If you need anything, you know where to get me." "Yes." "Oh, well," said Noel, and went to the door. She watched him from the stairs until it was shut, and then came up again, step by step, as though it was an effort, a little, and went on coming past her bedroom to his landing, to come in and ask him, entirely naturally, please to use the garden if he wanted to, and please not to mind marital rows. She was sure he understood. Things were difficult. Noel wouldn't be back for some time. He was a journalist. His work took him away a lot. Just as well. She committed herself to the just as well. She was a very economical speaker. So he took to sitting in the garden. It was a lovely place, a huge, hidden, walled South London garden, with old fruit trees at the end, a wildly waving, disorderly buddleia, curving beds full of old roses, and a lawn of overgrown, dense ryegrass. Over the wall at the foot was the common, with a footpath running behind all the gardens. She came out to the shed and helped him to assemble and oil the lawn-mower, standing on the little path under the apple branches, while he cut an experimental serpentine across her hay. Over the wall came the high sound of children's voices and the thunk and thud of a football. He asked her how to raise the blades. He was not mechanically minded. "The children get quite noisy," she said. "And dogs. I hope they don't bother you. There aren't many safe places for children round here." He replied truthfully that he never heard sounds that didn't concern him when he was concentrating. When he'd got the lawn into shape, he was going to sit on it and do a lot of reading, try to get his mind in trim again, to write a paper on Hardy's poems, on their curiously archaic vocabulary. "It isn't very far to the road on the other side, really," she said. "It just seems to be. The common is an illusion of space, really, just a spur of brambles and gorse bushes and bits of football pitch between 2 fast 4-laned main roads. I hate London commons. There's a lovely smell, though, from the gorse and the wet grass. It's a pleasant illusion." "No illusions are pleasant," she said decisively, and went in. He wondered what she did with her time. Apart from little shopping expeditions, she seemed to be always in the house. He was sure that when he'd met her, she'd been introduced as having some profession, vaguely literary, vaguely academic, like everyone else he knew. Perhaps she wrote poetry in her north-facing living room. He had no idea what it would be like. Women generally wrote emotional poetry, much nicer than men, as Kingsley Amis has stated, but she seemed, despite her placid stillness, too spare and too fierce, grim, for that. He remembered the screaming. Perhaps she wrote Plath-like chants of violence. He didn't think that quite fitted the bill either. Perhaps she was a freelance radio journalist. He didn't bother to ask anyone who might be a common acquaintance. During the whole year, he explained to the American at the party, he hadn't actually discussed her with anyone. Of course he wouldn't, she agreed vaguely and warmly. She knew he wouldn't. He didn't see why he shouldn't, in fact, but went on for the time with his narrative. They had got to know each other a little better over the next few weeks, at least on the level of borrowing tea or even sharing pots of it. The weather had got hotter. He had found an old-fashioned deck chair with faded striped canvas in the shed, and had brushed it over and brought it out onto his mown lawn, where he'd sat writing a little, reading a little, getting up and pulling up a tuft of couch grass. He had been wrong about the children not bothering him. There was a succession of incursions by all sizes of children looking for all sizes of balls, which bounced to his feet or crashed in the shrubs or vanished in the herbaceous border, black and white footballs, beach balls with concentric circles of primary colours, acid yellow tennis balls. The children came over the wall, black faces, brown faces, floppy long hair, shaven heads, respectable dotted sun hats and camouflaged cotton army hats from Millets. They came over easily, as though they were used to it. Sandals, training shoes, a few bare toes, grubby, sunburned legs, cotton skirts, jeans, football shorts. Sometimes, perched on the top, they saw him and gestured at the balls. One or two asked permission. Sometimes he threw a ball back, but was apt to knock down a few knobby little unripe apples or pears. There was a gate in the wall, under the fringing trees, which he once tried to open, spending time on rusty bolts, only to discover that the lock was new and secure, and the key not in it. The boy sitting in the tree did not seem to be looking for a ball. He was in a fork of the tree nearest the gate, swinging his legs, doing something to a knot in a frayed end of rope that was attached to the branch he sat on. He wore blue jeans and training shoes and a brilliant T-shirt, striped in the colours of the spectrum, arranged in the right order, which the man on the grass found visually pleasing. He had rather long blonde hair falling over his eyes, so that his face was obscured. "Hey, you! Do you think you ought to be up there? It might not be safe." The boy looked up, grinned, and vanished monkey-like over the wall. He had a nice, frank grin, friendly, not cheeky. He was there again the next day, leaning back in the crook of the tree, arms crossed. He had on the same shirt and jeans. The man watched him, expecting him to move again, but he sat immobile, smiling down pleasantly, and then staring up at the sky. The man read a little, looked up, saw him still there, and said, "Have you lost anything?" The child did not reply. After a moment he climbed down a little, swung along the branch hand over hand, dropped to the ground, raised an arm in salute, and was up and over the usual route over the wall. 2 days later, he was lying on his stomach on the edge of the lawn, out of the shade, this time in a white T-shirt with a pattern of blue ships and water lines on it, his bare feet and legs stretched in the sun. He was chewing a grass stem and studying the earth as though watching for insects. The man said, "Hi there," and the boy looked up, met his look with intensely blue eyes under long lashes, smiled with the same complete warmth and openness, and returned his look to the earth. He felt reluctant to inform on the boy, who seemed so harmless and considerate, but when he met him walking out of the kitchen door, spoke to him and got no answer but the gentle smile before the boy ran off towards the wall, he wondered if he should speak to his landlady. So he asked her, did she mind the children coming in the garden? She said no. Children must look for balls. That was part of being children. He persisted. They sat there too, and he had met one coming out of the house. He hadn't seemed to be doing any harm, the boy, but you couldn't tell. He thought she should know. He was probably a friend of her son's, she said. She looked at him kindly and explained. Her son had run off the common with some other children 2 years ago, in the summer, in July, and had been killed on the road. More or less instantly, she'd added dryly, as though calculating that just enough information would preclude the need for further questions. He said he was sorry, very sorry, feeling to blame, which was ridiculous, and a little injured because he'd not known about her son and might inadvertently have made a fool of himself with some casual reference whose ignorance would be embarrassing. What was the boy like, she said, the one in the house? I don't talk to his friends. I find it too painful. It could be Timmy or Martin. They might have lost something or want... He described the boy. Blonde, about 10 at a guess. He was not very good at children's ages. Very blue eyes, slightly built, with a rainbow-striped T-shirt and jeans mostly, though not always. Oh, and those football practice shoes, black and green. And the other T-shirt, with the ships and wavy lines, and an extraordinarily nice smile, a really warm smile. Nice-looking boy. He was used to her being silent, but this silence went on and on and on. She was just staring into the garden. After a time, she said in her precise conversational tone, "The only thing I want, the only thing I want at all in this world, is to see that boy." She stared at the garden, and he stared with her, until the grass began to dance with empty light, and the edges of the shrubbery wavered. For a brief moment, he shared the strain of not seeing the boy. Then she gave a little sigh, sat down neatly, as always, and passed out at his feet. After this, she became, for her, voluble. He didn't move after she fainted, but sat patiently by her until she stirred and sat up. Then he fetched her some water and would have gone away, but she talked. "I'm too rational to see ghosts. I'm not someone who would see anything there was to see. I don't believe in an afterlife. I don't see how anyone can. I always found a kind of satisfaction for myself in the idea that one just came to an end, to a sliced-off stop. But that was myself. I didn't think I thought ghosts were what people wanted to see or were afraid to see. And after he died, the best hope I had, it sounds silly, was that I would go mad enough so that instead of waiting every day for him to come home from school and rattle the letterbox, I might actually stop my body and mind waiting every day. Every day. I can't let go. And his bedroom, sometimes at night I go in. I think I might just for a moment forget he wasn't in there sleeping. I think I would pay almost anything, anything at all, for a moment of seeing him like I used to. In his pyjamas, with his hair ruffled and you said, that smile. When it happened, they got Noel, and Noel came in and shouted my name like he did the other day. That's why I screamed, because it seemed the same. And then they said, "He is dead," and I thought coolly, "is dead." That will go on and on and on till the end of time. It's a continuous present tense. One thinks the most ridiculous things. There I was thinking about grammar, the verb to be, when it ends to be dead. And then I came out into the garden, and I half saw in my mind's eye a kind of ghost of his face, just the eyes and hair coming towards me, like every day waiting for him to come home, the way you think of your son with such pleasure, when he's not there. And I thought, no, I won't see him because he is dead, and I won't dream about him because he is dead. I'll be rational and practical and continue to live because one must. And there was Noel. I got it wrong, you see. I was so sensible. And then I was so shocked because I couldn't get to want anything. I couldn't talk to Noel. I made Noel take away, destroy all the photos. I didn't dream. You can will not to dream. I didn't visit a grave, flowers. There isn't any point. I was so sensible. Only my body wouldn't stop waiting. And all it wants is to see that boy. That boy. That boy you saw. He did not say that he might have seen another boy, maybe even a boy who had been given the T-shirts and jeans afterwards. He did not say, though the idea crossed his mind, that maybe what he had seen was some kind of impression from her terrible desire to see a boy where nothing was. The boy had had nothing terrible, no aura of pain about him. He had been, his memory insisted, such a pleasant, courteous, self-contained boy, with his own purposes. And in fact the woman herself almost immediately raised the possibility that what he had seen was what she desired to see, a kind of mix-up of radio waves, like when you overheard police messages on the radio or got BBC One on a switch that said ITV. She was thinking fast, and went on almost immediately to say that perhaps his sense of loss, his loss of Anne, which was what had led her to feel she could bear his presence in her house, was what had brought them, dare she say, near enough for their wavelengths to mingle, perhaps, had made him susceptible. "You mean," he had said, "we are a kind of emotional vacuum between us that must be filled?" Something like that, she had said, and had added, "But I don't believe in ghosts." Anne, he thought, could not be a ghost, because she was elsewhere, with someone else, doing for someone else those little things she had done so gaily for him. Tasty little suppers, bits of research, a sudden vase of unusual flowers, a new bowl shirt, unlike his own cautious taste, but suiting him. In a sense, Anne was worse lost, because voluntarily absent, an absence that could not be loved, because love was at an end, for Anne. "I don't suppose you will now," the woman was saying. "I think talking would probably stop any mixing of messages, if that's what it is, don't you? But if he comes again," and here for the first time her eyes were full of tears, "if you must promise, you will tell me. You must promise." He had promised, easily enough, because he was fairly sure she was right. The boy would not be seen again. But the next day he was on the lawn, nearer than ever, sitting on the grass beside the deck chair, his arms clasping his bent, warm, brown knees, the thick, pale hair glittering in the sun. He was wearing a football shirt this time, Chelsea's colours. Sitting down in the deck chair, the man would have put out a hand and touched him, but he did not. It was not, it seemed, a possible gesture to make. But the boy looked up and smiled, with a pleasant complicity, as though they now understood each other very well. The man tried speech. He said, "It's nice to see you again," and the boy nodded acknowledgement of this remark, without speaking himself. This was the beginning of communication between them, or what the man supposed to be communication. He did not think of fetching the woman. He became aware that he was in some strange way enjoying the boy's company. His pleasant stillness, and he sat there all morning, occasionally lying back on the grass, occasionally staring thoughtfully at the house, was calming and comfortable. The man did quite a lot of work, wrote about 3 reasonable pages on Hardy's original air blue gown, and looked up now and then to make sure the boy was still there and happy. He went to report to the woman, as he had after all promised to do, that evening. She had obviously been waiting and hoping. Her unnatural calm had given way to agitated pacing, and her eyes were dark and deeper in. At this point in the story, he found in himself a necessity to bowdlerize for the sympathetic American, as he had indeed already begun to do so. He had mentioned only a child who had seemed like the woman's lost son, and he now ceased to mention the child at all. as an actor in the story, with the result that what the American woman heard was a tale of how he, the man, had become increasingly involved in the woman's solitary grief, how their two losses had become a kind of folie from which he could not extricate himself. What follows is not what he told the American girl, though it may be clear at which points the bowdlerized version coincided with what he really believed to have happened. There was a sense he could not at first analyze that it was improper to talk about the boy, not because he might not be believed, that did not come into it, but because something dreadful might happen. He sat on the lawn all morning in a football shirt. Chelsea? Chelsea. What did he do? Does he look happy? Did he speak? Her desire to know was terrible. He doesn't speak. He didn't move much. He seemed very calm. He stayed a long time. This is terrible. This is ludicrous. There is no boy. No. But I saw him. Why you? I don't know. A pause. I do like him. He was a most likable boy. Some days later, he saw the boy running along the landing in the evening, wearing what might have been pyjamas in peacock toweling, or might have been a tracksuit. Pyjamas, the woman stated confidentially when he told her. His new pyjamas. With white-ribbed cuffs, weren't they? And a white polo neck. He corroborated this, watching her cry. She cried more easily now, finding her anxiety and disturbance very hard to bear. But it never occurred to him that it was possible to break his promise to tell her when he saw the boy. That was another curious imperative from some undefined authority. They discussed clothes. If there were ghosts, how could they appear in clothes long burned or rotted or worn away by other people? You could imagine, they agreed, that something of a person might linger, as the Tibetans and others believe the soul lingers near the body before setting out on its long journey. But clothes? And in this case, so many clothes? I must be seeing your memories, he told her, and she nodded fiercely, compressing her lips, agreeing that this was likely, adding, I am too rational to go mad, so I seem to be putting it to you. He tried a joke. This isn't very kind to me to infer that madness comes more easily to me. No, sensitivity. I am insensible. I was always a bit like that, and this made it worse. I am the last person to see any ghost that was trying to haunt me. We agreed it was your memories I saw. Yes, we agreed. That's rational. As rational as we can be, considering. All the same, the brilliance of the boy's blue regard, his gravely smiling salutation in the garden next morning, did not seem like anyone's tortured memories of earlier happiness. The man spoke to him directly then. Is there anything I can do for you? Anything you want? Can I help you? The boy seemed to puzzle about this for a while, inclining his head as though hearing was difficult. Then he nodded quickly, and perhaps urgently, turned and ran into the house, looking back to make sure he was followed. The man entered the living room through the French windows, behind the running boy, who stopped for a moment in the centre of the room, with the man blinking behind him at the sudden transition from sunlight to comparative dark. The woman was sitting in an armchair, looking at nothing there. She often sat like that. She looked up, across the boy, at the man, and the boy, his face for the first time anxious, met the man's eyes again, asking, before he went on into the house. What is it? What is it? Have you seen him again? Why are you... He came in here. He went out through that door. I didn't see him. No. Did he... Oh, this is so silly. Did he see me? He could not remember. He told the only truth he knew. He brought me in here. Oh, what can I do? What am I going to do? If I killed myself... I have thought of that, but the idea that I should be with him is an illusion. This silly situation is the nearest I shall ever get to him. He was in here with me. Yes. And she was crying again. Out in the garden, he could see the boy, swinging agile on the apple branch. He was not quite sure, looking back, when he had thought he had realized what the boy wanted him to do. This was also, at the party, his worst piece of what he called bowdlerization, though in some sense it was clearly the opposite of bowdlerization. He told the American girl that he'd come to the conclusion that it was the woman herself who had wanted it, though there was, in fact, throughout, no sign of her wanting anything except to see the boy, as she said. The boy, bolder and more frequent, had appeared several nights running on the landing, wandering in and out of bathrooms and bedrooms, restlessly, a little agitated, questing almost, until it had come to the man that what he required was to be re-engendered. For him, the man, to give to his mother another child, into which he could peacefully vanish. The idea was so clear that it was like another imperative, though he did not have the courage to ask the child to confirm it. Possibly this was out of delicacy. The child was too young to be talked to about sex. Possibly there were other reasons. Possibly he was mistaken. His situation was making him hysterical. He felt action of some kind was required and must be possible. He could not spend the rest of the summer, the rest of his life, describing non-existent T-shirts and blonde smiles. He could think of no sensible way of embarking on his venture, so in the end he simply walked into her bedroom one night. She was lying there reading. When she saw him, her instinctive gesture was to hide, not her bare arms and throat, but her book. She seemed, in fact, quite unsurprised to see his pyjamaed figure, and after she'd recovered her coolness, brought out the book definitely and laid it on the bedspread. My new taste in illegitimate literature. I keep them in a box under the bed. Ina Twig, Medium, The Infinite Hive, The Spiritual World, Is There Life After Death? Pathetic, she offered. He sat down delicately on the bed. Please, don't grieve so. Please, let yourself be comforted. Please. He put his arm round her. She shuddered. He pulled her closer. He asked why she had only the one son, and she seemed to understand the purport of the question, for she tried, angular and chilly, to lean on him a little. She became apparently compliant. No real reason, she assured him. No material reason, just her husband's profession and lack of inclination. That covered it. Perhaps, he suggested, if she would be comforted a little, perhaps she could hope, perhaps... For comfort, then, she said dolefully, and lay back, pushing Ina Twig off the bed with one fierce gesture, then lying placidly. He got in beside her, put his arms around her, kissed her cold cheek, thought of Anne, of what was never to be again. Come on, he said to the woman, you must live, you must try to live. Let us hold each other for comfort. She hissed at him, don't talk, between clenched teeth, so he stroked her lightly over her nightdress, breasts and buttocks and long stiff legs, composed like an effigy on an Elizabethan tomb. She allowed this, trembling slightly and then trembling violently. He took this to be a sign of some mixture of pleasure and pain, of the return of life to stone. He put a hand between her legs and she moved them heavily apart. He heaved himself over her and pushed, unsuccessfully. She was contorted and locked tight. Frigid, he thought grimly, was not the word. Rigor mortis, his mind said to him, before she began to scream. He was ridiculously cross about this. He jumped away and said quite rudely, "Shut up!" and then ungraciously, "I'm sorry." She stopped screaming as suddenly as she'd begun and made one of her painstakingly economical explanations. "Sex and death don't go. I can't afford to let go of my grip on myself. I hoped what you had hoped. It was a bad idea. I apologize." "Oh, never mind," he said. and rushed out again onto the landing, feeling foolish and almost in tears for warm, lovely Anne. The child was on the landing, waiting. When the man saw him, he looked questioning, and then turned his face against the wall and leant there, rigid, his shoulders hunched, his hair hiding his expression. There was a similarity between woman and child. The man felt for the first time almost uncharitable towards the boy, and then felt something else. "Look, I'm sorry. I tried. I did. Please turn round." Uncompromising, rigid, clenched back view. "Oh, well," said the man, and went into his bedroom. "So now," he said to the American woman at the party, "I feel a fool. I feel we are hurting, not helping each other. I feel it isn't a refuge." "Of course you feel that," she said. "Of course you're right. It was temporarily necessary. It helped both of you, but you've got to live your life." "Yes," he said, "I've done my best. I've tried to get through. I have my life to live." "Look," she said, I want to help. I really do. I have these wonderful friends I'm renting this flat from. Why don't you come just for a few days? Just for a break. Why don't you? They're real sympathetic people. You'd like them. I like them. You could get your emotions kind of straightened out. She'd probably be glad to see the back of you. She must feel as bad as you do. She's got to relate to her situation in her own way in the end. We all have." He said he would think about it. He knew he'd elected to tell the sympathetic American because he'd sensed she would offer a way out. He had to get out. He took her home from the party and went back to his house and landlady without seeing her into her flat. They both knew that this reticence was promising, that he hadn't come in then because he meant to come later. Her warmth and readiness were like sunshine. She was open. He did not know what to say to the woman. In fact, she made it easy for him. She asked briskly if he now found it perhaps uncomfortable to stay, and he replied that he had felt he should move on. He was of so little... Very well, she had agreed, and had added crisply that it had to be better for everyone if all this came to an end. He remembered the firmness with which she had told him that no illusions were pleasant. She was strong, too strong for her own good. It would take years to wear away that stony, closed, simply surviving insensibility. It was not his job. He would go. All the same, he felt bad. He got out his suitcases and put some things in them. He went down to the garden, nervously, and put away the deck chair. The garden was empty. There were no voices over the wall. The silence was thick and deadening. He wondered, knowing he would not see the boy again, if anyone else would do so, or if, now he was gone, no one would describe a T-shirt and sandals, a smile, seen, remembered, or desired. He went slowly up to his room again. The boy was sitting on his suitcase, arms crossed, face frowning and serious. He held the man's look for a long moment, and then the man found himself speaking. "You do see, I have to go. I've tried to get through. I can't get through. I'm no use to you, am I?" The boy remained immobile, his head on one side, considering. The man stood up and walked towards him. "Please, let me go. What are we in this house? A man and a woman and a child, and none of us can get through. You can't want that." He went as close as he dared. He had, he thought, the intention of putting his hand on the child, but could not bring himself to feel there was no boy. So he stood and repeated, "I can't get through. Do you want me to stay?" Upon which, as he stood helplessly there, the boy turned on him again the brilliant, open, confiding, beautiful, desired smile. Black Dog by Penelope Lively. John Case came home one summer evening to find his wife huddled in the corner of the sofa with the sitting-room curtains drawn. She said there was a black dog in the garden, looking at her through the window. Her husband put his briefcase in the hall and went outside. There was no dog. A blackbird fled shrieking across the lawn, and next door someone was using a mower. He did not see how any dog could get into the garden. The fences at either side were 5 feet high, and there was a wall at the far end. He returned to the house and pointed this out to his wife, who shrugged and continued to sit hunched in the corner of the sofa. He found her there again the next evening, and at the weekend she refused to go outside and sat for much of the time watching the window. The daughters came, big girls with jobs in insurance companies, wardrobes full of bright clothes and £20,000 mortgages. They stood over Brenda Case and said she should get out more. She should go to evening classes, they said, join a health club, do a language course, learn upholstery, go jogging, take driving lessons. And Brenda Case sat at the kitchen table and nodded. She quite agreed. It would be a good thing to find a new interest. Jogging, upholstery, French. Yes, she said, she must pull herself together, and it was indeed up to her in the last resort. They were quite right. When they had gone, she drew the sitting-room curtains again and sat on the sofa, staring at a magazine they had brought. The magazine was full of recipes the daughters had said she must try. There were huge, bright, glossy photographs of puddings crested with alpine peaks of cream, of dark, glistening casseroles, and salads like an artist's palette. The magazine costed each recipe. A 4-course dinner for 6 worked out at £3.89 a head. It also had articles advising her on life insurance, treatment for breast cancer, and how to improve her love-making. John Case became concerned about his wife. She had always been a good housekeeper. Now they began to run out of things. When one evening there was nothing but cold meat and cheese for supper, he protested. She said she'd not been able to shop because it had rained all day. On rainy days the dog was always outside, waiting for her. The daughters came again and spoke severely to their mother. They talked to their father separately, in different tones, proposing an autumn holiday in Portugal or the Canaries, a new 3-piece for the sitting-room, a musk-wash coat. John Case discussed the whole thing with his wife reasonably. He did this one evening after he had driven the Toyota into the garage, walked over to the front door, and found it locked from within. Brenda, opening it, apologized. The dog had been round at the front today, she said, sitting in the middle of the path. He began by saying lightly that dogs have not been known to stand up on their hind legs and open doors. And in any case, he continued, there is no dog at all. The dog is something you are imagining. I have asked all the neighbours. Nobody has seen a big black dog. Nobody round here owns a big black dog. There is no evidence of a dog, so you must stop going on about this dog because it does not exist. What is the matter? He asked gently. Something must be the matter. Would you like to go away for a holiday? Shall we have the house redecorated? Brenda Case listened to him. He was sitting on the sofa with his back to the window. She sat listening carefully to him, and from time to time her eyes strayed from his face to the lawn beyond, in the middle of which the dog sat, its tongue hanging out and its yellow eyes glinting. She said she would go away for a holiday if he wished, and she would be perfectly willing for the house to be redecorated. Her husband talked about travel agents and decorating firms, and once he got up and walked over to the window to inspect the condition of the paintwork. The dog, Brenda saw, continued to sit there, its eyes always on her. They went to Marrakesh for 10 days. Men came and turned the kitchen from Primrose to Eau de Nil, and the hallway from Magnolia to Parchment. September became October, and Brenda Case fetched from the attic a big, gnarled walking stick that was a relic of a trip to the Tyrol many years ago. She took this with her every time she went out of the house, which nowadays was not often. Inside the house, it was always somewhere near her, its end protruding from under the sofa or hooked over the arm of her chair. The daughters shook their tousled heads at their mother, towering over her in their baggy, fashionable trousers and their big jackets. "It's not fair on Dad," they said. "Can't you see that? "You've only got one life," they said sternly, and Brenda Case replied that she realised that. She did indeed. "Well then," said the daughters, one on each side of her, bigger than her, brighter, louder, always saying what they meant, going straight to the point and no nonsense, competent with income tax returns and contemptuous of muddle. When she was alone, Brenda Case kept doors and windows closed at all times. Occasionally, when the dog was not there, she would open the upstairs windows to air the bedrooms and the bathroom. She would stand with the curtains blowing, taking in great gulps and draughts. Downstairs, of course, she could not risk this, because the dog was unpredictable. It would be absent all day, and then suddenly there it would be, squatting by the fence, or leaning hard up against the patio doors, sprung from nowhere. She would draw the curtains, resigned, or move to another room and endure the knowledge of its presence on the other side of the wall, a few yards away. When it was there, she would sit doing nothing, staring straight ahead of her, silent and patient. When it was gone, she moved around the house, prepared meals, listened a little to the radio, and sometimes took the old photograph albums from the bottom drawer of the bureau in the sitting room. In these albums the daughters slowly mutated from swaddled bundles topped with monkey faces and spiky hair to chunky toddlers, and then to spindly-limbed little girls in matching pinafores. They played on Cornish beaches or posed on the lawn, holding her hand, that same lawn on which the dog now sat on its hunkers. In the photographs she looked down at them, smiling, and they gazed up at her, or held out objects for her inspection, a flower, a seashell. Her husband was also in the photographs, a smaller man than now, it seemed, with a curiously vulnerable look, as though surprised in a moment of privacy. Looking at herself, Brenda saw a pretty young woman who seemed vaguely familiar, like some relative not encountered for many years. John Case realized that nothing had been changed by Marrakesh and redecorating. He tried putting the walking stick back up in the attic. His wife brought it down again. If he opened the patio doors, she would simply close them as soon as he'd left the room. Sometimes he saw her looking over into the garden with an expression on her face that chilled him. He asked her one day what she thought the dog would do if it got into the house. She was silent for a moment and then said quietly, she supposed it would eat her. He said he could not understand, he simply did not understand what could be wrong. It was not, he said, as though they had a thing to worry about. He gently pointed out that she wanted for nothing. It's not that we have to count the pennies any more, he said, not like in the old days. When we were young, said Brenda Case, when the girls were babies. Right, it's not like that now, is it? He indicated the 24-inch colour TV set, the video, the stereo, the microwave oven, the English rose-fitted kitchen, the bathroom with separate shower. He reminded her of the Bupa membership, the index-linked pension, the shares and dividends. Brenda agreed that it was not. It most certainly was not. The daughters came with their boyfriends, nicely spoken, confident young men in very clean shirts, who talked to Brenda of their work in firms selling computers and Japanese cameras, while the girls took John into the garden and discussed their mother. The thing is, she's becoming agoraphobic. She thinks she sees this black dog, said John Case. We know, said the eldest daughter, but that, frankly, is neither here nor there. It's a mechanism, simply, a ploy, like children do. One has to get to the root of it, that's the thing. It's her age, said the youngest. Of course it's her age, snorted the eldest, but it's also her. She was always inclined to be negative, but this is ridiculous. Negative? Said John Case. He tried to remember his wife, his wives, who, one of them, he could see inside the house, beyond the glass of the patio window, looking out at him from between two young men he barely knew. The reflections of his daughters, his strapping, prosperous daughters, were superimposed upon their mother, so that she looked at him through the cerise and orange and yellow of their clothes. Negative, a worrier. Look on the bright side, I say, but that's not Mum, is it? I wouldn't have said, he began. "She's unmotivated," said the youngest. "That's the real trouble. No job, no nothing. It's a generation problem, too." "I'm trying," their father began. "We know, Dad, we know, but the thing is she needs help. This isn't something you can handle all on your own. She'll have to see someone." "No way," said the youngest. "Will we get Mum into therapy?" "Dad can take her to the surgery," said the eldest, "for starters." The doctor, the new doctor, there was always a new doctor, was about the same age as her daughters Brenda Case saw. Once upon a time, doctors had been older men, fatherly and reliable. This one was good-looking in the manner of men in knitting pattern photographs. He sat looking at her, quite kindly, and she told him how she was feeling, insofar as this was possible. When she had finished, he tapped a pencil on his desk. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I see." And then he went on, "There doesn't seem to be any very specific trouble, does there, Mrs. Case?" She agreed. "How do you think you would define it yourself?" She thought. At last she said she supposed there was nothing wrong with her that wasn't wrong with, well, everyone. "Quite," said the doctor busily, writing now on his pad. "That's the sensible way to look at things. So I'm giving you this, 3 a day. Come back and see me in 2 weeks. When she had come out, John Case asked to see the doctor for a moment. He explained that he was worried about his wife. The doctor nodded sympathetically. John told the doctor about the black dog, apologetically, and the doctor looked reflective for a moment and then said, "Your wife is 54? John Case agreed. She was indeed 54. "Exactly," said the doctor. "So I think we can take it that with some care and understanding these difficulties will disappear. I've given her something," he said confidently. John Case smiled back. That was that. "It will go away," said John Case to his wife firmly. He was not entirely sure what he meant, but it did not do, he felt sure, to be irresolute. She looked at him without expression. Brenda Case swallowed each day the pills that the doctor had given her. She believed in medicines and doctors, had always found that aspirin cured a headache, and used to frequent the surgery with the girls when they were small. She was prepared for a miracle. For the first few days it did seem to her just possible that the dog was growing a little smaller, but after a week she realized that it was not. She continued to take the pills, and when at the end of a fortnight she told the doctor that there was no change, he said that these things took time. One had to be patient. She looked at him, this young man in his swivel chair on the other side of a cluttered desk, and knew that whatever was to be done would not be done by him, or by cheerful yellow pills like children's sweets. The daughters came to inspect and admonish. She said that, yes, she had seen the doctor again, and yes, she was feeling rather more herself. She showed them the new sewing machine with many extra attachments that she'd not used, and when they left she watched them go down the front path to their cars, swinging their bags and shouting at each other, and saw the dog step aside for them, wagging its tail. When they had gone, she opened the door again and stood there for a few minutes, looking at it. And the dog, 5 yards away, looked back, not moving. The next day, she took the shopping trolley and set off for the shops. As she opened the front gate, she saw the dog come out from the shadow of the fence, but she did not turn back. She continued down the street, although she could feel it behind her, keeping its distance. She spoke in a friendly way to a couple of neighbours, did her shopping and returned to the house, and all the while the dog was there, 20 paces off. As she walked to the front door, she could hear the click of its claws on the pavement, and had to steel herself so hard not to turn round, that when she got inside, she was bathed in sweat and shaking all over. When her husband came home that evening, he thought her in a funny mood. She asked for a glass of sherry, and later she suggested they put a record on instead of watching TV, West Side Story, or another of those shows they went to years ago. He was surprised at the change in her. She began to go out daily, and although in the evenings she often appeared to be exhausted, as though she'd been climbing mountains instead of walking suburban streets, she was curiously calm. Admittedly, she'd not appeared agitated before, but her stillness had not been natural. Now he sensed a difference. When the daughters telephoned, he reported their mother's condition and listened to their complacent comments. That stuff usually did the trick, they said. All the medics were using it nowadays. They'd always known Mum would be okay soon. But when he put the telephone down and returned to his wife in the sitting room, he found himself looking at her uncomfortably. There was an alertness about her that worried him. Later, he thought he heard something outside and went to look. He could see nothing at either the front or the back, and his wife continued to read a magazine. When he sat down again, she looked across at him with a faint smile. She had started by meeting its eyes, its yellow eyes, and thus she had learned that she could stop it, halt its patient shadowing of her, leave it sitting on the pavement or the garden path. She began to leave the front door ajar, to open the patio window. She could not say what would happen next, knew only that this was inevitable. She no longer sweated or shook. She did not glance behind her when she was outside, and within she hummed to herself as she moved from room to room. John Case, returning home on an autumn evening, stepped out of the car and saw light streaming through the open front door. He thought he heard his wife speaking to someone in the house. When he came into the kitchen, though, she was alone. He said the front door was open, and she replied that she must have left it so by mistake. She was busy with a saucepan at the stove, and in the corner of the room, her husband saw, was a large dog basket towards which her glance occasionally strayed. He made no comment. He went back into the hall, hung up his coat, and was startled suddenly by his own face, caught unawares in the mirror by the hat stand, and seeming like someone else's, that of a man both older and more burdened than he knew himself to be. He stood staring at it for a few moments, and then took a step back towards the kitchen. He could hear the gentle chunking sound of his wife's wooden spoon stirring something in the saucepan, and then, he thought, the creak of wickerwork. He turned sharply and went into the sitting room. He crossed to the window and looked out. He saw the lawn, blackish in the dusk, disappearing into darkness. He switched on the outside lights and flooded it all with an artificial glow. The grass, the little flight of steps up to the patio, and the flower bed at the top of them, from which he'd tided away the spent summer annuals at the weekend. The bare earth was marked all over, he now saw, with what appeared to be animal footprints. And as he stood gazing, it seemed to him that he heard the pad of paws on the carpet behind him. He stood for a long while, before at last he turned round. Who's Been Sitting in My Car? By Antonia Fraser. Who's been sitting in my car? Said Jacobine. She said it in a stern, gruff voice, like a bear. In fact, Jacobine looked more like Goldilocks, with her pale, fair hair pulled back from her round forehead. The style betokened haste and worry, the worry of a girl late for school. But it was Jacobine's children who were late, and she was supposed to be driving them. Someone's been smoking in my car, Jacobine added, pointing to the ashtray crammed with butts. Someone's been driving your car, you mean? It was Gavin, contradictory as usual. People don't just sit in cars, they drive them, he elaborated. Someone's been driving my car, said the little bear. People do sit in cars. We're sitting in a car now. Tessa, because she was 12 months older, could never let that sort of remark from Gavin pass. Be quiet, darlings, said Jacobine automatically. She continued to sit looking at the ashtray in front of her. It certainly looked quite horrible with all its mess of ash and brown stubs, and there was a sort of violence about the way it had been stuffed. You wondered that the smoker had not bothered to throw at least a few of them out of the window. Instead, he had remorselessly gone on pressing them into the little chromium tray, harder, into the stale pyre. Jacobine did not smoke. Rory, her ex-husband, had been a heavy smoker, and for one moment she supposed that Rory might have used an old key to get into the Mini, and then sat endlessly smoking outside the house. It was a mad thought, and almost instantly Jacobine recognised it as such. For one thing, she'd bought the Mini second-hand after the divorce. Since ferrying the children had become her main activity these days, she'd spent a little money on making it as convenient as possible. More to the point, Jacobine and Rory were on perfectly good terms. Married too young, was the general verdict. Jacobine agreed. She still felt rather too young for marriage, as a matter of fact. In an upside-down sort of way, 2 children seemed to be all she could cope with. She really quite liked Rory's new wife, Fiona, for her evident competence in dealing with the problem of living with him. It was only that the mucky, filled ashtray had reminded Jacobine of the household details of life with Rory. But if not Rory, who? And why did she feel, on top of disgust, a very strong sensation of physical fear? Jacobine, habitually timid, did not remember feeling fear before in quite such an alarmingly physical manner. Her terrors were generally projections into the future possible worries concerned with the children. She was suddenly convinced that the smoker had an ugly streak of cruelty in his nature, as well as being, of course, a potential thief. She had a nasty new image of him sitting there in her car outside her house, waiting for her, watching the house. She dismissed it. "Tessa, Gavin, stay where you are." Jacobine jumped out of the driver's seat and examined the locks of the car. "Mummy, we're going to be late," whined Tessa. That decided Jacobine. Back to the car, key in lock, and away. They had reached the corner of Melville Street when the next odd thing happened. The engine died, and the little Mini gradually and rather feebly came to a halt. "No petrol!" shouted Gavin from the back. "Oh, darling, do be quiet," began Jacobine. Then her eye fell on the gauge. He was right. The Mini was out of petrol. Jacobine felt completely jolted, as if she'd been hit in the face. It was as uncharacteristic of her carefully ordered existence to run out of petrol as, for example, to run out of milk for the children's breakfast, a thing which had happened once and still gave Jacobine shivers of self-reproach. In any case, another unpleasantly dawning realization: she had only filled up 2 days ago. "Someone's definitely been driving this car," she exclaimed before she could stop herself. "That's what I said," crowed Gavin. "Someone's been driving my car," said the little bear. "Oh, Mummy, we're going to be awfully late," pleaded Tessa. "Miss Hamilton doesn't like us to be late. She says Mummy should be more thoughtful." The best thing to do was to take them both to school in a taxi and sort out the car's problems later. One way and another, it was lunchtime before Jacobine was able to consider the intruding driver again. And then, sturdily, she dismissed the thought, so that, curiously enough, finding the Mini once more empty of petrol and the ashtray packed with stubs the following morning was even more of a shock. Nor was it possible to escape the sharp eyes of the children, or gloss over the significance of the rapid visit to the petrol station. In any case, Tessa had been agonizing on the subject of lateness due to petrol failure since breakfast. "I shall go to the police," said Jacobine firmly. She said it as much to reassure herself as to shut up the children. In fact, the visit was more irritating than reassuring. Although Jacobine began her complaint with the statement that she had locked the car and the lock had not been tampered with, she was left with the strong impression that the police did not believe any part of her story. They did not seem to accept either that the doors had been locked or that the petrol was missing, let alone appreciate the significance of the used ashtray. All the same, they viewed her tale quite indulgently, and were positively gallant when Jacobine revealed that she lived, as they put it, "with no man to look after you. Course you worry about the car, madam, it's natural. I expect your husband did all that when you were married," said the man behind the broad desk. "Tell you what, I know where you live. I'll tell the policeman on the beat to keep a special watch on it, shall I? Set your mind at rest. That's what we're here for. Prevention is better than cure." Jacobine trailed doubtfully out of the station. Prevention is better than cure. It was this parting homily which gave her the inspiration to park the Mini for the night directly under the streetlight, which again lay under the children's window. If the police did not altogether believe her, she did not altogether believe them or their kindly promises. Anyway, the light would make their task easier if they did choose to patrol the tree-shaded square. That evening, Jacobine paid an unusually large number of visits to the children's room after they went to sleep. Each time, she looked cautiously out of the window. The Mini, small and green, looked like a prize car at the motor show in its new spotlight. You could hardly believe it had an engine inside it. It might have been a newly painted dummy. The shock of seeing the Mini gone on her 5th inspection was therefore enormous. At the same time, Jacobine did feel a tiny pang of satisfaction. Now let the police treat her as a hysterical female, she thought, as she dialed 999 with slightly shaking fingers. Her lips trembled too as she dictated the number of the car. AST 5690, a bright green Mini, stolen not more than 10 minutes ago. I warned you it might happen. Don't worry, madam, we'll put out a general call on it. Why did everyone tell her not to worry? No, it's my car, not my husband's. I haven't got a husband. Jacobine tried to sleep after that, but her mind raced, half in rage at the impudence of the intruder, half in imagined triumph that he would be hauled before her, cigarette hanging from his lips, those telltale polluting cigarettes. It was the doorbell weaving in and out of these dreams which finally ended them. At first she assumed they were bringing round the thief, even at this time of night. It was a policeman, a new one from the morning's encounter, but he was alone. Mrs. Esk, sorry to call so late. About your stolen Mini. Have you found it? Who took it? Well, that's the point, madam. A green Mini, number AST 5690, reported stolen 20 minutes ago at Ferry Road Police Station, is now outside your door. Jacobine stared. It was true. The Mini was back. He must have known you were looking for him. She blurted out the remark and then regretted it. Silently, Jacobine in her quilted dressing gown and slippers, and the policeman in his thick night-black uniform, examined the Mini from every angle. The locks were pristine, and the car itself locked. They examined the dashboard. It was untouched. Perhaps there was some mistake, suggested the policeman in the gentle tone Jacobine had come to associate with his colleagues. You only looked out of the window, you said, in the lamplight, you know. Well, I'd better be getting back to the station and report that all is well. You don't want to be arrested for driving your own Mini tomorrow, do you? He sounded quite paternal. Look, he only had time for 2 cigarettes, said Jacobine suddenly. On the other hand, there was a new and rather horrible development. The car positively smelt. It did. She did not like to point that out to the policeman, since he had not mentioned it. Perhaps he was embarrassed. It was a strong, pungent, human smell, which had nothing to do with Jacobine or the children, or even cigarettes. As Jacobine had envisaged someone cruel and even violent when she first saw the ashtray, she now conjured up involuntarily someone coarse and even brutal. Jacobine had not thought much about sex since the end of her marriage. She now found herself thinking of it in spite of herself. It was the unmistakable animal smell of sex which overpoweringly filled her nostrils. The next night, she put the children to bed early. Still fully dressed, with a new large torch beside her, she took up her vigil in the lobby next to the front door. A little after 11 o'clock, with apprehension but also with excitement, she heard the noise of the engine running. It was close to the house. It was the peculiar coughing start of her own car. Without considering what she was doing, Jacobine flung open the front door, ran towards the curb and shouted, "Stop it! Stop it! Stop, thief!" The engine stopped running instantly. It was as though it had been cut short in mid-sentence. She wrenched upon the handle of the passenger seat, her fingers trembling so much that she fumbled with the familiar door. It did not open. Even locked against her, her own car. In her passion, Jacobine rapped hard on the window. Nothing happened. Very slowly, she realized that the driver's seat, and indeed the whole of the tiny car, was empty. In the ashtray, illuminated by the street lamp like a detail in a moonlight picture, lay one cigarette, still alight. Jacobine was now suddenly aware of her thumping heart as the anger which had driven her on drained away. For the first time, she had no idea what to do. After a pause during which she stood gazing at the locked Minnie and the gradually disintegrating cigarette, she walked back to the house. She picked up the car keys. Even more slowly, she returned to the car and unlocked it. Deliberately but very gingerly, she climbed into the front seat and touched the cigarette. Yes, warm. The car smelt fearfully. "Sweetheart," said a voice very close to her ear. "You shouldn't have told the police, you know. You shouldn't have done that. You have to be punished for that, don't you?" Jacobine felt herself grasped roughly and horribly. What happened next was so unexpected in its outrageous nature that she tried to scream out her revulsion, but at the same time a pair of lips, thick, hard, rubbery lips, were pressed onto her own. The car was still, to her staring frantic eyes above her muted mouth, palpably empty. "Oh, God, I've been taken," she thought, as she choked and struggled. "But you like it, don't you, sweetheart?" As though she had managed to speak aloud. It was not true. "I'm going to be sick, I think," said Jacobine. This time she did manage to say it aloud. "But you'll come back for more tomorrow night, won't you, sweetheart?" said the voice. "And we'll go for a drive together." She was released. Jacobine fumbled with the door once more, and half-retching, fled towards the house. She did not dare leave it again that night, but lay in her bed, trembling and shaking. Even a bath didn't help to wash away her body's memories of the assault. The next morning, as soon as the children were at school, Jacobine went to the police station. From the start, the man behind the desk was altogether more wary of her, she thought. He listened to her news story with rather a different expression, no less kind, but somewhat more speculative. At the end, without commenting on Jacobine's nocturnal experience, he asked her abruptly if she'd ever seen a doctor since the break-up of her marriage. "I need the police, not a doctor, for something like this," said Jacobine desperately. "I need protection." "I'm not quite so sure, Mrs. Esk," said the policeman. "Now, look here, why don't you have a word first of all with your GP? It's not very pleasant being a woman on your own, is it? Maybe a few pills, a few tranquilizers." When Jacobine left the station, it was with a sinking feeling that he'd not believed her at all. The rest of the day, she agonized over what to do. Ring Rory? That was ridiculous. But Jacobine had no other figure of authority in her life. A lawyer might help, she thought vaguely, remembering the sweet young man who'd helped her over the divorce. Yet even a lawyer would ask for more proof, if the police had proved so sceptical. With dread, Jacobine realized that it was up to her to provide it. About 11 o'clock that night, therefore, she took up her position in the driver's seat. She was not quite sure what to expect, except that there would be a moment's wait while she settled herself. "I'm glad you're early, sweetheart," said the voice conversationally, "because we'll be able to go for a really long drive. We've got so much to talk about, haven't we? The children, for example. I don't really like your children. You will have to get rid of them, you know." "Don't you dare touch my children," gasped Jacobine. "Oh, rather you than me," said the voice. "My methods aren't as pretty as yours. A car crash on the way to school, for example, which would leave you uninjured." Jacobine gave a sick little cry. She envisaged those precious, tended bodies, the recurrent nightmare of motherhood. "I know all about crashes and children, their precious bodies," went on the voice. He seemed to read her thoughts, her ghastly images. "Poor little mangled things." Jacobine could no longer bear it. The smell, combined with terror, overwhelmed her. And the police station was so near. Jumping out of the car, abandoning her persecutor, she ran along the road in the general direction of the station. A few minutes later, she heard the engine start up. The car was following her. Her heart banged in her chest. She had time to think that it was more frightening being pursued by a car, an empty car. She gained the safety of the steps. The car stopped neatly and remained still. "He's threatening the children now. He says he's going to kill them," Jacobine began her story. It seemed that she had hardly gulped it out before a policewoman was taking her back, on foot, to her house. The policewoman concentrated on the fact that Jacobine had left her children alone in the house while she went out to the car. Indeed, although it had not occurred to Jacobine at the time, it was very much outside her usual character. The car was driven back by a policeman. It looked very chic and small and harmless when it came to rest once more outside her front door. It was 2 days later that Rory rang up. In between, Jacobine had not dared to leave the intruder alone in the car at night, in case he'd carried out his threat against the children during the day. On Saturday he performed the same act of possession which had initiated their relationship. On Sunday he brought up the subject of the children again. First he made Jacobine drive as far as Arthur's Seat, then round through silent Edinburgh. Jacobine was tired when she got back, and the Minnie was allowed to park beside her house once more. A policeman noted her sitting there, a smouldering cigarette propped above the dashboard, and he heard her cry out. In answer to his question, she would only point to the cigarette. She was wearing, he saw, a nightdress under her coat. At the time, the policeman was not quite sure whether Jacobine was crying out in terror or delight. Actually, what had forced that strange, hoarse sound out of Jacobine was neither fear nor pleasure. It was, in its weird way, a sort of cry of discovery, a confirmation of a dread, but also bringing relief from the unknown. She had got to know, perforce, the voice a little better during their long night drive. It was some chance remark of his about the car, some piece of mechanical knowledge, which gave her the clue. Proceeding warily, because the voice could often, but not always, read her thoughts, Jacobine followed up her suspicions. In any case, she preferred talking about the car to listening to the voice on the subject of her children. She tried to shut her mind to his jibes and sometimes quite surprisingly petty digs against Tessa and Gavin. He seemed to be out to belittle the children as well as eliminate them from Jacobine's life. "Fancy Gavin not being able to read. At 7, he would say. I heard him stumbling over the smallest words the other day. What a baby." And again, "Tessa makes an awful fuss about being punctual for one so young, doesn't she? I can just see her when she grows up, a proper little spinster. If she grows up, that is." Jacobine interrupted this by wondering aloud how she got such a bargain in the shape of a second-hand Minnie which had hardly done 1,000 miles. "Oh, yes, sweetheart," exclaimed the voice. "You certainly did get a bargain when you bought this car. All things considered, it had always been very well looked after, I can tell you." "Then it was your car?" Jacobine tried to stop her own voice shaking as she burst out with her discovery. "This was your car once, wasn't it?" "There was an accident," replied the voice. He spoke in quite a different tone, she noticed, dully, flatly, nothing like his usual accents, which varied from a horrid, predatory kind of lustfulness to the near frenzy of his dislike for the children. "Tell me." "It was her children, on the way to school. There was an accident." It was still quite a different tone, so much so that Jacobine almost thought, it was a ridiculous word to use under the circumstances, that he sounded quite human. The smell in the car lessened, and even the grip which he habitually kept on her knee, the odious grip, seemed to become softer, more beseeching than possessing. She worked so hard. She always had so many things to do for them. I was just trying to help her, taking them to school for her. It was an accident, a mistake. Otherwise, why didn't I save myself? An accident, I tell you. And she won't forgive me. Oh, why won't she forgive me? I can't rest till she forgives me." It was piteous now, and Jacobine heard a harsh, racking sobbing, a man's sobbing which hurts the listener. She yielded to some strange new impulse and tentatively put out her hand towards the passenger seat. The next moment she was grasped again, more firmly than before. The assault began again, the smell intensified. "I've got you now, sweetheart, haven't I?" said the voice. It doesn't matter about her anymore. Let her curse me all she likes. We've got each other. Once we get rid of your children, that is. And I'm awfully good at getting rid of children. When Rory rang on Monday, he was uneasy and embarrassed. It's all so unlike Jacobine, he complained later to Fiona. She's really not the type. And you should have heard some of the things she told the policeman this fellow in the car had done to her. Oh, those quiet types, exclaimed Fiona. Without knowing Jacobine intimately, she had always thought it odd that she should have surrendered such an attractive man as Rory, virtually without a struggle. Still waters, Fiona added brightly. Rory suggested a visit to the doctor. He also wondered whether the strain of running a car... Jacobine felt the tears coming into her eyes. Why hadn't she thought of that? Get rid of him. Get rid of the car. Free herself. Oh, Rory, she begged, would you take Tessa and Gavin for a few days? I know it's not your time, and I appreciate Fiona's job. I'll have them at the weekend, suggested Rory, always as placating as possible, out of guilt that Jacobine, unlike him, had not married again. Fiona's got a marketing conference this week, and I'll be in Aberdeen. No, please, Rory, today, I implore you. I tell you what, I'll send them round in a taxi. I won't come too. I'll just put them in a taxi this afternoon. But Rory was adamant. It would have to be the weekend. That afternoon, picking up Tessa and Gavin from school, Jacobine very nearly hit an old woman on a zebra crossing. She'd simply not seen her. She could not understand it. She always slowed down before zebra crossings, and yet she'd been almost speeding across this one. Both children bumped themselves badly, and Gavin in the front seat, who was not wearing his safety belt, another odd factor since Jacobine could have sworn she fastened it herself, cut himself on the driver mirror. That's your warning, he said that night. The children must go. You spend too much time thinking about them and bothering about them. Tiresome little creatures. I'm glad they hurt themselves this afternoon. Crybabies, both of them. Besides, I don't want you having any other calls on your time. And Jacobine was wrenched very violently to and fro, shaken like a bag of shopping. The next moment was worse. A cigarette was stubbed hard on her wrist, just where the veins ran. Even at the instant of torture, Jacobine thought, now they'll have to believe me. But it seemed that they didn't. In spite of the mark, and in spite of the fact that surely everyone knew Jacobine did not smoke. A doctor came, and Rory came. Jacobine got her wish in the sense that Tessa and Gavin were taken away by Rory. Fiona had to break off halfway through her marketing conference, although you would never have guessed it from the cheery way she saluted the children. Just because their mother's gone nuts, Fiona said sensibly to Rory afterwards, doesn't mean that I can't give them a jolly good tea, and supper too. I have no idea what happened about their meals with all that jazzing about at night and running around in her nightie and screaming. Then Rory took Jacobine down to a really pleasant countrified place not far from Edinburgh, recommended by the doctor. It had to be Rory. There was no one else to do it. Jacobine was very quiet all the way. Rory wondered whether it was because he was driving her car, the car. But Fiona needed the Cortina to fetch the children from school. Once or twice he almost thought Jacobine was listening to something in her head. It gave him a creepy feeling. Rory put on the radio. "Don't do that," said Jacobine quite sharply for her. "He doesn't like it." Rory thought it prudent to say nothing, but he made a mental note to report back to Fiona when he got home. For it was Fiona who felt some concern about dispatching Jacobine in this way. "It's really rather awful, darling," she argued, taking her children away from her. "They're all she had in her life, poor dotty girl." "They are my children, too," Rory said humbly. But he knew just what Fiona meant. He admired her more than ever for being so resolutely kind-hearted. It was wonderful how well she got on with both Tessa and Gavin as a result. Fiona also took her turn visiting Jacobine when Rory was too busy. There were really no limits to her practical good nature. And so it was Fiona who brought back the news. "She wants the car." "The car?" cried Rory. I should have thought that was the very last thing she should have under the circumstances. Not to drive. She doesn't even want the keys, just the car. She says she likes the idea of sitting in it. It makes her feel safe to know the car's there and not free to go about wherever it likes. I promise you, those were her very words. What did Dr. Mackey say? Seems very rum to me. Oh, he seemed quite airy about it. Talked about womb transference. Can that be right? Anyway, that sort of thing. He said it could stay in the grounds. Like a sort of Wendy house, I suppose. She hasn't been making very good progress. She cries so much, you see. It's pathetic. Poor thing, let her have the car. She has so little, ended Fiona generously. So Jacobine got her car back. Dr. Mackey had it parked as promised in a secluded corner of the gardens. He was encouraged to find that Jacobine cried much less now. She spent a good deal of time sitting alone in the driver's seat, talking to herself. She was clearly happier. "It's much better like this," said the voice. "I'm glad we got rid of your children the nice way. You won't ever see them again, you know." Jacobine did not answer. She was getting quite practiced at pleasing him. He was generally waiting for her when she arrived at the Minnie in its shady corner. "Who's been sitting in my car?" she would say in a mock, gruff voice, pointing to the heap of butts in the ashtray. But in spite of everything, Jacobine still looked more like Goldilocks than a bear. Indeed, her face had come to look even younger since she lost the responsibility of the children. Or so Fiona told Rory. Jacobine had to be specially charming on the days when Fiona came to visit, in case he got into her car and went back to find the children after all. She thought about them all the time. But she no longer cried in front of him, because that made him angry, and then he would leave her. She had to keep him sitting beside her. That way the children would be safe. From him. Don't Tell Sissy, by Celia Fremlin. "Friday, then, the 6:10 from Liverpool Street," said Rosemary, gathering up her gloves and bag. "And don't tell Sissy," she added. "You will be careful about that, won't you, Lois?" I nodded. People are always talking like this about Sissy. She's that kind of person. She was like that at school, and now, when we're all coming up towards retirement, she's like it still. You know the kind of person I mean? Friendly, good-hearted, and desperately anxious to be in on everything, and yet with this mysterious knack of ruining things, of bringing every project grinding to a halt simply by being there. Because it wasn't ever her fault, not really. "Let me come, oh please let me come too," she'd beg, when 3 or 4 of us from the lower fourth had schemed up an illicit trip to the shops on Saturday afternoon. And because she was our friend, well, sort of. Anyway, it was our set that she hovered on the fringe of all the time, not anyone else's. Because of this, we usually let her come. And always it ended in disaster. She'd be the one to slip on the edge of the curb outside Woolworths and cut her knees so that the blood ran, and a little crowd collected, and a kind lady rang up the school to have us fetched home. She'd be the one to get lost, to miss the bus, to arrive back at school bedraggled and tear-stained and late for evening preparation, hopelessly giving the game away for all of us. You'd think, wouldn't you, that after a few such episodes she'd have given up, or at least have learned caution. But no, her persistence, perhaps one would have called it courage if only it hadn't been so annoying. Well, her persistence, then, was indomitable. Neither school punishments nor the reproaches of her companions ever kept her under for long. "Oh, please let me come," she'd be pleading again, barely a week after the last debacle. "Oh, please, don't be so mean." And so there, once again, she'd inexorably be, back in action once more, throwing up in the middle of the dormitory feast, crying with blisters as we trudged back from a ramble out of bounds, soaked and shivering and starting pneumonia from having fallen through the ice of the pond we'd been forbidden to skate on. So you can understand, can't you, why Rosemary and I didn't want Sissy with us when we went to investigate the ghost at Rosemary's new weekend cottage. Small as our chances might be of pinning down the ghost in any case, Sissy could have been counted on to reduce them to 0, dropping a tray of tea things just as the rapping began, calling out, "What? I can't hear anything," as we held our breaths trying to locate the ghostly sobbing, falling over a tombstone as we tiptoed through the moonlit churchyard. No, Sissy must at all costs be kept out of our little adventure, and by now, after nearly half a century, we knew that the only way of keeping Sissy out of anything was to make sure that she knew nothing about it right from the beginning. But let me get back to Rosemary's new cottage. I say new because Rosemary has only recently bought it, not because the cottage itself is new. Far from it. It is early 18th century, and damp and dark, and built of the local stone, and Rosemary loves it. Did love it, rather. But let me not get ahead of myself. Anyway, as I was saying, Rosemary loved the place, loved it on sight, and bought it almost on impulse with the best part of her life savings. Their life savings, I suppose I should say, because she and Norman are still married to each other, and it must have been his money just as much as hers. But Norman never seems to have much to do with these sort of decisions. Indeed, he doesn't seem to have much to do with Rosemary's life at all these days. Certainly he never comes down to the cottage. I think that was part of the idea, really, that they should be able to get away from each other at weekends. During the week, of course, it's all right, as they're both working full-time, and they both bring plenty of work home in the evenings. Rosemary sits in one room correcting history essays, while Norman sits in another working out export quotas or something, and the mutual non-communication must be almost companionable, in an arid sort of way. But the crunch will come, of course, when they both retire in a year or so's time. I think Rosemary was thinking of this when she bought the cottage. It would become a real port in a storm then, a bolt hole from what she refers to as the last and worst lap of married life. At one time, we used to be sorry for Sissy, the only one of our set who never married. But now, when the slow revolving of the decades have left me a widow and Rosemary stranded among the flotsam of a dead marriage, now, lately I've begun wondering whether Sissy hasn't done just as well for herself as any of us in the long run. Certainly, she has had plenty of fun on the fringes of other people's lives over the years. She wangles invitations to silver wedding parties, worms her way into other people's family holidays, and even if it ends up with the whole lot of them in quarantine at the airport because of Sissy coming out in spots, well, at least she's usually had a good run for her money first. And, to be fair on her, it's not just the pleasures and luxuries of our lives that she tries to share, it's the problems and crises too. I remember she managed to be present at the birth of my youngest son, and if only she hadn't dropped the boiling kettle on her foot just as I went into the second stage of labour, her presence would have been a real help. As it was, the doctor and midwife were both busy treating her for shock in the kitchen and binding up her scalded leg, while upstairs my son arrived unattended, and mercifully without fuss. Perhaps even the unborn are sensitive to atmosphere. Perhaps he sensed even then that with Sissy around it's just no use anyone else making a fuss about anything. But let me get back to Rosemary's haunted cottage. Or not haunted, as the case may be. Let me not prejudge the issue before I've given you all the facts. Of course, to begin with, we were half playing a game, Rosemary and I. The tension tends to go out of life as you come up towards your 60s. Whatever problems once tore at you and kept you fighting and alive and gasping for breath, they're solved now, or else have died quietly while you weren't noticing. Anyway, what with one thing and another, life can become a bit dull and flavourless when you get to our age, and to be honest, a ghost was just what Rosemary and I were needing. A spice of danger, a spark of the unknown to reactivate these waterlogged minds of ours, weighed down as they are by such a lifetime's accumulation of the known. I'm telling you this because I want to be absolutely honest. In evaluating the events I am to describe, you must remember and allow for the fact that Rosemary and I wanted there to be a ghost. Well, no, perhaps that's putting it too strongly. We wanted there to might be a ghost, if you see what I so ungrammatically mean. We wanted our weekend to bring us at least a small tingling of the blood, a tiny prickling of the scalp. We wanted our journey to reach a little way into the delicious outskirts of fear, even if it did have to start from Liverpool Street. We felt marvellously superior, Rosemary and I, as we stood jam-packed in the corridor, rocking through the rainy December night. We glanced with secret pity at all those blank commuter faces, trundling towards the security of their homes. We were different. We were travelling into the unknown. Our first problems, of course, were nothing to do with ghosts. They were to do with milk and bread and damp firewood, and why Mrs. Thorpe from the village hadn't come in to air the beds as she promised. She hadn't filled the lamps either, or brought in the paraffin. How did she think Rosemary was going to get it from the shed in all this rain and dark? And where were all those tins she'd stocked up with in the summer? They couldn't all have been eaten. I'm afraid I left it all to Rosemary. I know visitors are supposed to trot around at the heels of their hostesses, yapping helpfully like terriers, but I just won't. After all, I know how little help it is to me when I am a hostess, so why should I suppose that everyone else is different? Besides, by this time I was half frozen, what with the black, sodden fields and marshlands without, and the damp stone within, and so I decided to concentrate my meagre store of obligingness on getting a fire going. What a job it was, though. It was as if some demon was working against me, spitting and sighing down the cavernous chimney, whistling wickedly along the icy stone-flagged floor, blowing out each feeble flicker of flame as fast as I coaxed it from the damp balls of newspaper piled under the damper wood. Fortunately, there were plenty of matches, and gradually, as each of my abortive efforts left the materials a tiny bit drier than before, hope of success came nearer. Or maybe it was that the mischievous demon grew tired of his dance of obstruction, the awful sameness of frustrating me time and time again. Anyway, for whatever reason, I at last got a few splinters of wood feebly smouldering. Bending close and cupping my hands to protect them from the sudden damp gusts and sputters of rain down the chimney, I watched enchanted, while first one tiny speck of gold and then another glimmered on the charred wood, another and yet another, until suddenly, like the very dawn of creation, a flame licked upwards. It was the first time in years and years that I had had anything to do with an open fire. I have lived in centrally heated flats for almost all of my adult life, and I had forgotten this apocalyptic moment when fire comes into being under your hands. Like God on the morning of creation, I sat there, all-powerful, tending the spark I had created. A sliver more of wood here, a knob of coal there. Soon my little fire was bright and growing and needing me no more. But still I tended it, or pretended to, leaning over it, spreading my icy hands to the beginnings of warmth. Vaguely in the background I was aware of Rosemary blundering around the place, clutching in her left hand the only oil lamp that worked, peering disconsolately into drawers and cupboards and muttering under her breath at each new evidence of disorder and depletion. Honestly, it was no use trying to help. We'd have to manage somehow for tonight, and then tomorrow, with the coming of the blessed daylight, we'd be able to get everything to rights, fill the lamps, fetch food from the village, get the place properly warm. Warm! Oh, I shivered and huddled closer into the wide chimney alcove. Although the fire was burning up nicely now, it had as yet made little impact on the icy chill of the room. It was cold as only these ancient, little-used cottages can be cold. The cold of centuries seems to be stored up in their old stones, and the idea that you can warm it away with a single brisk weekend of paraffin heaters and hastily lit fires has always seemed to me laughable. Not to Rosemary, though. She is an impatient sort of person, and it always seems to her that heaters must produce heat. That's what the word means. So she was first angered, then puzzled, and finally half scared by the fact that she just couldn't get the cottage warm. Even in late August, when the air outside was still soft and the warmth of summer lingered over the fields and marshes, even then the cottage was like an icebox inside. I remember remarking on it during my first visit. Marvellously cool was how I put it at the time, for we had just returned hot and exhausted from a long tramp through the hazy, windless countryside, and that was the first time, I think, that Rosemary mentioned to me that the place was supposed to be haunted. One of those tragic wailing ladies that the past specialises in, she explained, rather facetiously. She's supposed to have drowned herself away on the marsh somewhere, for love, I suppose. It always was, wasn't it? My God, though, what a thing to drown oneself for. If only she'd known. This set us off giggling, of course, and by the time we'd finished our wry reminiscences and our speculations about the less-than-ecstatic love lives of our various friends, by this time, of course, the end of the ghost story had rather got lost. Something about the woman's ghost moaning around the cottage on stormy nights, or was it moonlight ones? about the permanent icy chill that had settled upon the cottage, and particularly upon the upstairs back bedroom, into which they'd carried her body, all dripping wet from the marsh. "As good a tale as any for when your tenants start demanding proper heating," I remember remarking cheerfully, for Rosemary at that time had vague and grandiose plans for making a fortune by letting the place for part of the year, and we'd both laughed, and that, it had seemed, was the end of it. But when late summer became autumn, and autumn deepened into winter, and the northeast winds straight from Siberia howled in over the marshes, then Rosemary began to get both annoyed and perturbed. "I just can't get the place warm," she grumbled. "I can't understand it. And as for that back room, the one that looks out over the marsh, it's uncanny how cold it is. 2 oil heaters burning day and night, and it's still—" I couldn't pretend to be surprised. As I say, I expect my friends' weekend cottages to be like this, but I tried to be sympathetic. And when, late in November, Rosemary confessed, half laughing, that she really did think the place was haunted, it was I who suggested that we should go down together and see if we could lay the ghost. She welcomed the suggestion with both pleasure and relief. "If it was just the cold, I wouldn't be bothering," she explained, "but there seems to be something eerie about the place. There really does, Lois. It's like being in the presence of the dead." Rosemary has never been in the presence of the dead, or she'd know it's not like that at all. But I let it pass. "I'm getting to hate being there on my own. Sometimes, I know it sounds crazy, but sometimes I really do seem to hear voices." She laughed uncomfortably. "I must be in a bad way, mustn't I? Hearing voices? Me?" To this day, I don't know how much she was really scared, and how much she was just trying to work a bit of drama into her lonely and probably unexpectedly boring trips down to her dream cottage. I don't suppose she even knows herself. All I can say for certain is that her mood of slightly factitious trepidation touched exactly on some deep need of my own, and at once we knew that we would go. And that it would be fun, and that Sissy must at all costs be kept out of it. Once her deep needs get involved, you've had it. A little cry from somewhere in the shadows, beyond the circle of firelight, jerked me from my reverie, and for a moment I felt my heart pounding. Then, a moment later, I was laughing, for the cry came again. "Spaghetti! Spaghetti bolognese! 4 whole tins of it, all stacked up under the sink. Now, who could have—" And who could care anyway? Food, real food, was now within our grasp, unless— Oh dear. "I bet you've lost the tin opener," I hazarded, with a sinking heart, for at the words spaghetti bolognese I had realised just how hungry I was, and it was with corresponding relief that in the flickering firelight I saw a smug smile overspreading her face. "See?" She held up the vital implement. It flickered through the shadows like a shining minnow as she gesticulated her triumph. "See?" Though, of course, if Sissy had been here— We both began to giggle. And later, as we sat over the fire, scooping spaghetti bolognese from pottery bowls and drinking the red wine which Rosemary had managed to unearth, as we sat there, revelling in creature comforts, we amused ourselves by speculating on the disasters which would have befallen us by now, had Sissy been one of the party. How she would have dropped the last of the matches into a puddle, looking for a lost glove, would have left the front door swinging open in the wind, blowing out our only oil lamp. And the tin opener, of course, would have been a write-off from the word go. If she hadn't lost it in some dark corner, it would certainly have collapsed into 2 useless pieces under her big willing hands. By now, we would have been without light, heat, or food. This depressing picture seemed somehow to be the funniest thing imaginable, as we sat there, with our stomachs comfortably full, and with our 3rd helping of red wine gleaming jewel-like in the firelight. "To absent friends," we giggled, raising our glasses. "And let's hope they remain absent," I added wickedly, thinking of Sissy. And while we were both still laughing over this cynical toast, I saw Rosemary suddenly go rigid, her glass an inch from her lips, and I watched the laughter freeze on her face. "Listen," she hissed. "Listen. Lois, do you hear?" For long seconds we sat absolutely still, and the noises of the night impinged for the first time on my consciousness. The wind, rising now, was groaning and sighing around the cottage, moaning in the chimney and among the old beams. The rain spattered in little gusts against the windows, which creaked and rattled on their old hinges. Beyond them, in the dark, overgrown garden, you could hear the stir and rustle of bare twigs and sodden leaves, and beyond that again there was the faint, endless sighing of the marsh, mile upon mile of it, half hidden under the dry winter reeds. "No?" I began in a whisper. But Rosemary made a sharp little movement, commanding silence. "Listen," she whispered once more, and this time, or was it in my imagination, I did begin to hear something. "Ee, ee, ee," came the sound, faint and weird upon the wind. "Ee, ee, ee." And for a moment it sounded so human and so imploring that I too caught my breath. It must be a trick of the wind, of course. It must. And as we sat there, tensed almost beyond bearing by the intentness of our listening, another sound impinged upon our preternaturally sharpened senses, a sound just as faint and just as far away, but this time very far from ghostly. The sound grew nearer, unmistakable, the prosaic sound of a car bouncing and crunching up the rough track to the cottage. Rosemary and I looked at each other. "Norman?" she hazarded, scrambling worriedly to her feet. "But it can't be Norman. He never comes. And at this time of night, too. Oh, dear, I wonder what can have happened." By this time she had reached the window, and she parted the curtains just as the mysterious vehicle screeched to a halt outside the gate. All I could see from where I sat was the triangle of darkness between the parted curtains and Rosemary's broad back, rigid with disbelief and dismay. Then she turned to me. "Lois," she hissed, "how could you?" I didn't ask her what she meant. Not after all these years. "I didn't. Of course I didn't. What do you take me for?" I retorted. And I don't doubt that by now my face was almost as white as hers. For, of course, she did not need to tell me who it was who had arrived. Not after nearly half a century of this sort of thing. Besides, who else was there who slammed a car door as if slapping down an invasion from Mars? Who else would announce her arrival by yelling "Yoo-hoo!" into the midnight air and bashing open the garden gate with a hatbox so that latch and socket hurtled together into the night? "Oops, sorry," said Sissy, for perhaps the 50,000th time in our joint lives, and she blundered forward towards the light like an untidy grey moth. For by now we had got the front door open, and lamplight was pouring down the garden path, lighting up her round, radiant face and her halo of wild grey curls, all a-glitter with drops of rain. "You naughty things! Fancy not telling me!" she reproached us as she surged through the lighted doorway, dumping her luggage to left and right. It was, as always, like a one-man army of occupation. Always she manages to fill any situation so totally with herself and her belongings and her eagerness that there simply isn't room for anyone else's point of view. It's not selfishness exactly, it's more like being a walking takeover bid, with no control over one's operations. "A real live ghost, isn't it thrilling?" she babbled, as we edged her into the firelit room. "Oh, but you should have told me. You know how I love this sort of thing." On and on she chattered, in her loud, eager, unstoppable voice, and this too we recognized as part of her technique of infiltration. By the time her victims have managed to get a word in edgeways, their first fine fury has already begun to wilt. The cutting edge of their protests has been blunted, their sense of outrage has become blurred, and anyway, by that time she is there, inescapably, irreversibly there. Well, what can you do? By the time Rosemary and I got a chance to put a word in, Sissy already had her coat off, her luggage spilling onto the floor, and a glass of red wine in her hand. There she was, reclining in the big, easy chair, mine, the firelight playing on her face, exactly as if she'd lived in the place for years. "But, Sissy, how did you find out?" was the nearest, somehow, that we could get to a reproof. And she laughed her big merry laugh, and the bright wine sloshed perilously in her raised glass. Simple, you poor Watsons, she declared. You see, I happened to be phoning Josie, and Josie happened to mention that Mary had said that Phyllis had told her that she'd heard from Ruth and... See what I mean? You can't win. You might as well try to dodge the recording angel himself. And when I heard about the ghost, then of course I just had to come, she went on. It sounded just too fascinating. You see, it just happens that at the moment I know a good deal about ghosts because... Well, of course she did. It was her knowing a good deal about classical Greek architecture last spring that had kept her arguing with the guide on the Parthenon for so long that the coach went off without us. And it was precisely because she'd boned up so assiduously on rare alpine plants that she'd broken her leg trying to reach one of them a couple of years ago, and we had to call out the mountain rescue for her. The rest of us had thought it was just a daisy. Yes, well, we don't even know yet that there is a ghost, said Rosemary dampingly. But not dampingly enough, evidently, for we spent the rest of the evening, and indeed far into the small hours, trying to dissuade Sissy from putting into practice, then and there, various uncomfortable and hazardous methods of ghost hunting, of which she'd recently informed herself, methods which ranged from fixing a tape recorder on the thatched roof to ourselves lying all night in the churchyard, keeping our minds a blank. By 2 o'clock, our minds were blank anyway. Well, Rosemary's and mine were, and we could think about nothing but bed. Here, though, were new obstacles to be overcome, for not only was Sissy's arrival unexpected and unprepared for, but she insisted on being put in the haunted room. If it was haunted. Anyway, the room that was coldest, dampest, and most uncomfortable, and therefore entitled her, well, what can you do, to the only functioning oil heater and more than her share of the blankets. "Of course I shan't sleep," she promised, as if this was some sort of special treat for me and Rosemary. "I shall be keeping vigil all night long. And tomorrow night, darlings, as soon as the moon rises, we must each take a white willow twig and pace in silent procession through the garden." We nodded, simply because we were too sleepy to argue. But beyond the circle of lamplight, Rosemary and I exchanged glances of undiluted negativism. I mean, apart from anything else, you'd have to be crazy to embark on any project which depended for its success on Sissy's not falling over something. But we did agree, without too much reluctance, to her further suggestion that tomorrow morning we should call on the vicar and ask him if we might look through the parish archives. Even Sissy, we guardedly surmised, could hardly wreck a call on a vicar. But the next morning, guess what? Sissy was laid up with lumbago, stiff as a board and unable even to get out of bed, let alone go visiting. "Oh, dear, oh, please don't bother," she kept saying as we ran around with hot water bottles and extra pillows. "Oh, dear, I do so hate to be a nuisance." We hated her to be a nuisance too, but we just managed not to say so, and after a bit our efforts, combined with her own determination not to miss the fun, yes, she was still counting it fun, after a bit all this succeeded in loosening her up sufficiently to let her get out of bed and onto her feet, and at once her spirits rocketed sky-high. She decided gleefully that her affliction was a supernatural one, consequent on sleeping in the haunted room. "Damp sheets, more likely," said Rosemary witheringly, "if people will turn up unexpectedly like this." But Sissy was unsquashable. Damp sheets, when the alternative was the ghost of a lady who died 200 years ago? Sissy has never been one to rest content with a likely explanation, if there is an unlikely one to hand. "I know what I'm talking about," she retorted. "I know more about this sort of thing than either of you. I'm a sensitive, you see. I only discovered it just recently, but it seems I'm one of those people with a sort of sixth sense when it comes to the supernatural. It makes me more vulnerable, of course, to this sort of thing. Look at my bad back. But it also makes me more aware. I can sense things. Do you know, the moment I walked into this room last night, I could tell that it was haunted. I could feel the... Oh!" Her back had caught her again. All that gesticulating while she'd talked had been a mistake. However, between us we got her straightened up once more, and even managed to help her down the stairs, though I must say it wasn't long before we were both wishing we'd left well alone, if I may put it so uncharitably. For Sissy up was far, far more nuisance than Sissy in bed. In bed her good intentions could harm no one, but once up and about there seemed no limit to the trouble she could cause in the name of helping. trying to lift pans from shelves above her head, trying to rake out cinders without bending and setting the hearth-brush on fire in the process, trying to fetch paraffin in cans too heavy for her to lift and slopping it all over the floor. Rosemary and I seemed to be forever clearing up after her or trying to uncrick her from some position she'd got stuck in for some maddening altruistic reason. Disturbingly, she seemed to get worse as the day went on, not better. The stiffness increased, and by afternoon she looked blue with cold and was scarcely able to move. But nothing would induce her to let us call a doctor or put her to bed.
"What? And miss all the fun?" she protested through numbed lips. "Don't you realise that this freezing cold is significant? It's the chilling of the air that you always get before the coming of an apparition."
By now it was quite hard to make out what she was saying. So hoarse had her voice become, and so stiff her lips, but you could still hear the excitement and triumph in her croaked exhortations.
"Isn't it thrilling? This is the chill of death, you know, darlings. It's the warning that the dead person is now about to appear. Oh, I'm so thrilled. Any moment now, and we're going to know the truth."
We did, too. A loud knocking sounded on the cottage door, and Rosemary ran to answer it. From where I stood in the living-room doorway, I could see her framed against the winter twilight. Already the short December afternoon was nearly at an end. Beyond her, I glimpsed the uniforms of policemen, heard their solemn voices.
"Miss Cecily Curtis?
Sissy? Yes, of course we know her," I heard Rosemary saying in a frightened voice. And then came the two deeper voices, grave and sympathetic. I could hardly hear their words from where I was standing, yet somehow the story wasn't difficult to follow. It was almost as if, in some queer way, I'd known it all along. How last night, at about 10:30 p.m., a Miss Cecily Curtis had skidded while driving too fast along the Dyke Road and had plunged, car and all, into deep water. The body had only been recovered and identified this morning. As I say, I did not really need to hear the men's actual words. Already the picture was in my mind, the picture which has never left it. The picture of Sissy, all lit up with curiosity and excitement, belting through the rain and dark to be in on the fun. Nothing would keep her away, not even death itself. A little sound in the room behind me roused me from my state of shock, and I turned to see Sissy smiling that annoying smile of hers for the very last time. It's maddened us for years, the plucky way she smiles in the face of whatever adversity she's got us all into.
"You see," she said a trifle smugly, "I've been dead ever since last night. It's no wonder I've been feeling so awful."
And with a triumphant little toss of her head, she turned, fell over her dressing-gown cord, and was gone. Yes, gone. We never saw her again. The object they carried in, wet and dripping from the marsh, seemed to be nothing to do with her at all. We never discovered whether the cottage had been haunted all along, but it's haunted now, all right. I don't suppose Rosemary will go down there much anymore. Certainly we will never go ghost hunting there again. Apart from anything else, we're too scared. There is so much that might go wrong. It was different in the old days when we could plan just any wild escapade we liked, confident that whatever went wrong would merely be the fault of our idiotic, infuriating, impossible, irreplaceable friend.